Conway Hall, London, where ethics matter.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Robert Hugill, and my contact details are up there if anybody wants to chat to me later. Tonight's concert, we're going to be hearing Robert Max performing Bach's 6 cello suites. So tonight's concert talk is going to explore what we know and what we don't know about the suites. And I've entitled the talk, In Search of Bach's Cello Suites. Bach wrote 6 suites for solo cello. They're some of the most frequently performed and well-recognized works for the solo instrument. He probably composed them sometime between 1717 and 1723, when he was Kapellmeister in Köthen. But we actually know very little about the music and about the background, though I'm hoping to fill you in on a little bit of what we do know. In 1728, his wife, Anna Magdalena Bach, copied out the music, and that important manuscript still survives. On the title of that, they are titled, rather macaronically, Suite a Violoncello Solo senza basso. But before we start talking about the music, I thought a little background. Bach was born in Eisenach in 1685 in a very, very musical family. This is his father, Johann Ambrosius, who was the director of the town musicians in Eisenach, and Bach's uncles were composers, and he had cousins who were composers as well. When he was older, Bach would be immensely proud of his cousins and his forebears and would assemble a Bach archive which survives to this day and is a very important resource for music from the generations before Bach himself. On the death of his parents, Bach goes to live with his eldest brother, Johann Christoph. He's an organist in Ohrdruf, and he studied with Pachelbel, which means that the young Bach was exposed to the music of Pachelbel and Froberger, but also Lully and Marais. And later on, Bach would study in Lüneburg at the university, and there he would be introduced to a wider range of European culture. He would start out his career as a junior court musician at the ducal court in Weimar. Then he moves to a new church in Arnstadt, which is just 19 kilometers southwest of Weimar. Now, unlike his contemporaries Handel and Telemann, Bach's place of birth and his places of employment are all within a tight area. They centered on Weimar, with Leipzig in the east and Eisenach in the west. But his reputation spreads, and he develops a reputation as a keyboard player and improviser. The young Johann Sebastian has quite a varied career, and he's rather different from the very settled gentleman in Leipzig that we tend to think of. Now, this is the settled gentleman with a piece of music and a nice big wig, painted in 1746. And I'm not convinced that that date is right. But we have no image of the young Bach. The only one we do have is of the middle-aged gentleman. But whilst he was in Arnstadt, he fell out with the musicians and one of them attacked him. As a result, he goes off to Mühlhausen. And there, as part of his job application, he submits his early cantata, Christ lag in Todesbanden, which survives and is one of the earliest surviving Bach cantatas. Then he goes back to Weimar, where he is organist and director of music at the ducal court. But things aren't always good, and the nadir comes in 1717 when he's arrested in Weimar because he's fallen out of favour at court. And he's jailed for a month and then dismissed. This is from the court record. On November the 6th, the quondam concertmaster and organist Bach was confined to the county judge's place of detention for too stubbornly forcing the issue of his dismissal. And finally, on December the 2nd, was freed from arrest with notice of his unfavourable discharge. So there. But whilst in Weimar, he had a sustained and important period of composition, including both keyboard and orchestral works. He began the preludes and fugues, which would become the well-tempered clavier. He started the Orgelbüchlein, and when he was promoted to director of music, he starts a monthly cantata series. And in 1717, when he leaves Weimar, he's still only 32, relatively young man, but has already had a 14-year career. And he's quickly re-employed as Kapellmeister, director of music, by Leopold, Prince of Anhalt-Köthen. Now, the Prince and Bach had already met. And the Prince was a musician. He appreciated Bach's talent, and he paid well. And he gave Bach a job with considerable latitude when it came to composition and performance. In Köthen, Bach was the princely Kapellmeister, the peak of the conventional musical hierarchy. And Bach would never be a mere organist again. In 1723, when he leaves Köthen, he goes to Leipzig, and there he is the Thomas Cantor, in charge of the music for 3 churches and a school. Bach and Leopold had made acquaintance almost certainly at the wedding of Leopold's sister, Eleonora Wilhelmina, who had married Ernst August I, Duke of Saxe-Weimar, who was one of the 2 ruling dukes in Weimar at the time of Bach's employment. The wedding was at the bride's mother's estate in January 1716. There was a celebratory cantata sung. Its text survives. It is thought to be by Bach, but the music doesn't survive and we're not certain. But it looks as if he wrote something and met the prince, who decided this was a likely lad. Leopold and Bach had a very good relationship. Leopold would be godfather to Bach's son Leopold Augustus, who died in infancy in 1719. And in 1729, after Bach had left his employ, he would return to Köthen for Prince Leopold's funeral. There would be a funeral cantata written by Bach, Klagt Kinder, Klagt es alle Welt, BWV 2449, and the then Mrs. Bach, Anna Magdalena, would sing the solo soprano part in the cantata. But Leopold was a Calvinist. That meant church music was very simple. So, Bach's music during his time at Köthen is almost entirely secular, mainly instrumental, orchestral, and the odd secular cantata. It did have an advantage, though. In 1713, 4 years before Bach joined, the court cappella, the instrumental ensemble, was actually quite small. But that year, they had an influx of personnel, a group of distinguished musicians from Berlin who were looking for employment. They'd been made redundant when King Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia dissolved his father's court capella. The perils of working for kings. So, one of the people, isn't that strange? Sorry, I've missed an image out. This gentleman here is Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen. I apologise for managing to miss him. This is Christian Ferdinand Abel with his sons. Abel was a violinist and a gambist, very distinguished. He and Bach were friends. And when Abel came to Curtin, he also brought his brother, who was a landscape gardener. Very useful family to know. Not only were Abel and Bach friends, their sons became friends. Johann Christian Bach and Carl Friedrich Abel would launch the first subscription concert series in London. So when Bach takes over his duties in Curtin, the cappella includes 16 musicians, at least one of which is a friend of Bach's, and the core of 8 are chamber musicians who are well-trained virtuosi. That's a far more experienced band than you'd expect at such a tiny little court. And also to Bach's benefit was the fact that though Leopold was a Calvinist, he balanced modest Calvinist understatement with luxurious princely excess, and as a result didn't mind spending on music. And in 1730, Bach would say of his time in Curtin, "There I had a gracious prince who loved and knew music." And the prince did indeed play the violin, the gamba, and keyboards. There was a theory at one point that Bach's gamba sonatas had been written for Leopold, but this is now discounted. Back in Weimar, 1708 to 1717, Bach had been furiously mugging up on the latest compositional styles, studying Vivaldi, Corelli, and Torelli. And he absorbed the stylistic aspects by transcribing their music. There are lots and lots of organ transcriptions of concertos, Vivaldi's string and wind concertos, and he also transcribed them for harpsichord and strings. And these survive because he recycled them for the Collegium Musicum in Leipzig, but over in the 1720s. Bach was attracted to the Italian style. One or more solo instruments alternating section by section with the full orchestra. And this would play a formative influence on the creation of his own music, both orchestral and instrumental. But at the same time, he was embracing the idea of dance music, not so much to dance to, but as forms to be used in instrumental writing. So we'll be talking about that further when we come to discussing the music of the suites. This is the first page of the most important manuscript of the suites. This is the suites in the handwriting of Anna Magdalena Bach, created in 1728. Not much survives in terms of manuscripts from Bach's time in Curtin. It's not helped by the fact that the library of the court cappella disappeared. Curtin was absorbed into a much larger principality in the early 19th century, and at that time the library just evaporated. So few of the 12 cantatas that Bach probably wrote whilst he was there have survived, and the ones that do survive are the ones that he recycled as sacred cantatas in Leipzig. Because in Curtin the cantatas were secular. They were more like serenades, they were performed in the evening, and there'll be dance music as well. So, links to contemporary opera. And the young Bach was familiar with opera. He would have to go occasionally to Hamburg, and there he's known to have gone to the Theater am Gänsemarkt, which is where the opera happened. The manuscript of the violin sonatas and partitas, the unaccompanied violin sonatas and partitas, amazingly does survive. That means that we know it was completed by 1720. The manuscript of the cello suites, the original manuscript, does not survive. Nor are we certain about the dates of the orchestral suites that he was writing. The music that we have of those is the music that he reused in Leipzig, and we don't have the originals from Curtin. Our view of this period of Bach is very much filtered through what survives because it was copied out again in Leipzig. The cello suites, as we've seen, were copied out by Anna Magdalena in 1728. They'd married in 1721 after the death of his first wife and moved to Leipzig in 1723. And whilst her manuscript is entirely clear and gives an accurate view of the suites, and we presume it's a view of the suites endorsed by Bach, there are some controversies. We've thankfully got over the slightly mad idea that because she wrote out the manuscript, Anna Magdalena actually wrote it. But there are still disagreements over the articulations. Some would say that they're eccentric and deficient, whilst other people say that the unconventional slurring works with the harmony. I think it's up to each cellist to decide what he or she feels. Also, the dating of the suites is problematic because we don't have that important first manuscript. Before or after the solo violin sonatas and partitas. There's a general agreement at the moment the cello suites come first. We also question what instrument it was written for. Now you might say, well, that's obvious, they're written for a cello. But the 18th century had a remarkably loose and imprecise use of terminology. And for instance, the sixth suite is written for a 5-string cello. There's been suggestions that all of them were written for a smaller cello called a violoncello da spalla, which is played on the shoulder. That's been reconstructed and people have recorded the suites. There's a lady playing one. As you can see, it's designed for violinists who have a limited ability to play the cello between the legs. It's held on the shoulder and the chest, but is far bigger than a viola. But as we'll discuss, Bach actually had 2 virtuoso cellists in his court cappella, so this is probably the more unlikely idea. But terminology, as I've said, in the 18th century is vague, and at other points in his orchestral writing, Bach would refer to the violoncello piccolo, which may or may not be this instrument, or may simply be a small cello. What was musical life like? Well, this is Schloss Köthen as it survives today. Köthen is a small town, so inevitably the musicians of the court cappella formed a close-knit community. Bach would have a warm relationship with them. He was godfather to their children. He would hold weekly rehearsals in his house, and we have to presume there was a regular schedule of performances at court. Concertos, suites, sonatas, solo pieces. Music either for entertainment or as background music for court events. And the music would be by Bach, but would be other people as well. The novelty would be new pieces and new works by the distinguished composer in their midst. And Bach's work at this period is considerable. The Brandenburg concertos, the first versions of those, the French suites, the completion of the Well-Tempered Clavier, the violin sonatas and partitas, the cello suites, and a few vocal items. There were some cantatas, these celebratory ones, the secular ones. There'd be one each year for Prince Leopold's birthday and another one on New Year's Day. The court cappella had no singers attached. They weren't needed because there were no regular church services to sing at. Instead, there would be guests. Singers would be guesting and perform. One of these was a young woman called Anna Magdalena Wilke, a soprano, who would eventually become Anna Magdalena Bach. But horn players as well were guest musicians. This is what is now known as the Bach Saal in Schloss Köthen, and we can imagine Bach's music being performed there at court events. We've got no knowledge of who performed the suites, whether they were written for a special performance at court, But the court cappella included the cellist Karl Bernhard Lienecke, who was one of the Berliners, very distinguished. But also our old friend Christian Ferdinand Abel, though he was employed to play the violin and the gamba, was also a fine cellist. And perhaps with two virtuoso cellists, Bach was just simply tempted to take advantage and use both of them. There have been suggestions that the cello suites might have been used like Bieber's 1676 Rosary Sonatas, a sequence of sonatas for unaccompanied violin, which were used in church as instrumental meditations. It's tempting, but very unlikely, given that it's a Calvinist church services, and there's no evidence. We have to also point out that Bach did attend Lutheran services in Curtin, but that's as far as we can go with that idea. The lack of a strong performing tradition means that a cellist can come to the music without too many preconceptions. The modern revival dates back to the Catalan cellist Pablo Casals. He discovered them as a teenager and made a specialty of playing them in public. Before Casals, the cello suites were never thought of as concert works. And so to the music. There are 6 suites, each with 6 movements. Each suite has the same structure. We start with a free prelude, the only non-dance movement in each suite. Then comes an allemande, which was a popular instrumental dance, usually used as the first or second movement of a suite. During Bach's period, it was often quadruple time and slower in tempo. Then comes the courante, a dance movement of moderate duple or faster triple time. Johann Mattheson would say in 1739 of it, the passion or emotion in which the courante should be performed is sweet hope. Next, a sarabande, slow triple time dance, and if you're actually dancing this, then the emphasis is on the second beat. Again, Mattheson. The dance sarabande must be even more narrow and grandiose. It has to express no other emotion but that of veneration. Then a pair of galanteries, 2 minuets, 2 bourrées, or 2 gavottes. Artful, graceful, joyful dancing. And then finally a gigue, another joyful dance in compound time. In instrumental music, it was common to pair the allemande and courante. And as Bach includes a pair of galanteries as well, the structure becomes symmetrical. Prelude, allemande and courante pair, sarabande in the middle, 2 galanteries, gigue. This consistency is almost unique in Bach's output and does rather suggest that the suites were conceived as a whole. And then there's the matter of the dance rhythms. How danceable do we expect this music to be? Well, Bach used dance forms not to write dance music, but to create a variety of rhythm and tempo within the music. And so performers can vary as to whether the movements could be danced to, but Bach wouldn't have expected it. An interesting point to make is the majority of movements are actually chordal, made up of multiple notes rather than a single melodic line. And for example, the prelude to Suite Number 1 is almost entirely arpeggiated, that is, spread chords. As with the solo violin music, the cello suites show that Bach's command of virtuoso techniques gives him the ability to create dense counterpoint and refined harmony without an accompanying keyboard instrument. And he does this simply by adding the occasional chord and odd notes, suggesting harmony in a sophisticated way. The 5th suite was originally designed for scordatura. That is, the A string was tuned down to G. though nowadays this is often performed in the version with conventional tuning. Suite number 6 was almost certainly designed for a 5-string cello, the 5th string tuned to E above the A. Only 3 sources mention the 5-stringed instrument, and only one, Anna Magdalena Bach, gives the tunings, but we can assume that because she mentions it, it's actually exactly what Bach intended. If you're a cellist and you play the 6th suite on a 4-string instrument, then some of those notes are going to be crucially and perilously high. And what does survive in terms of manuscripts? The earliest is from 1726, created in Leipzig by a friend of Bach's, Johann Kellner. He was a flautist and an organist. There are no bowings, just phrasing. It's unfinished, and suite number 5 is normal tuning, not scordatura. And then we move on to Anna Magdalena Bach's 1728. She was his second wife, 16 years his junior, and as we've heard, was a singer herself, professional, from a family of musicians. Whilst her professional engagements stop after about 1725, she continues to support Bach by copying right through to the 1740s. And her fair copies include the cello suites, the violin sonatas and partitas, the organ trio sonatas BWV 525 to 530, major sections of the well-tempered clavier, the Kyrie and Gloria of the Mass in B minor, and numerous vocal and instrumental works. And if any of you have actually copied out manuscript by hand, you will realise what a considerable amount of lifetime's work that is. By comparison, Bach's first wife, Maria Barbara, left few traces. Anna Magdalena, at the same time, had 13 children, of which 6 survived to adulthood, and when she married Bach, there were 4 children alive from Bach's first marriage. So that is a considerable brood. There's one more manuscript, but this dates from after 1750, so after Bach's death, and was written by a cellist, presumably close to the Bach circle. The technical demands of the music, the etude-like nature, and the difficulty of interpreting them because the original manuscript isn't annotated at all, meant the suites were little known and barely performed until Casals. Bach transcribed at least one of them. The 5th suite survives as the lute suite BWV 995, and this transcription is in Bach's own hand. But they weren't published until 1824. In Paris, surprisingly, by Janet et Cotel, 6 sonates ou études pour le violoncelle solo. The preface describes them as studies. Monsieur Norblin, principal cello of the Académie Royale de Musique, that is the opera, has finally reaped the fruits of his perseverance by the discovery of this manuscript. These studies by Bach for the cello are no less important than his other works, and the publication of this book cannot fail to obtain great success. Well, despite a reprint in Germany in 1825 and a new German edition in 1826, there was no great success. Nobody played them. In 1860s, there was something of a revival, but people added piano accompaniments to them. This failed except as a teaching exercise. Schumann added piano accompaniments to them, but after his death, his wife Clara and the family friend, the violinist Joseph Joachim, destroyed these as being substandard, though one does survive in a later copy. Finally, in 1879, the suites are published in the collected edition being published by the Bach Gesellschaft in Leipzig. And then, a few years later, the young Pablo Casals comes across them in a shop in about 1890, and he has the greatest revelation of my life, as he described it. He rediscovers the suites in this Bach Gesellschaft edition, and he's the first cellist of international renown to perform them in concert. He would make a pioneering recording of them in the 1930s. Other people would be interested in the suites as well, so I'm going to finish with two curiosities that you may care to try and seek out. Joachim Raff, in 1868, published arrangements for solo piano, and in 1923, Leopold Godowsky made piano transcriptions of suites 2, 3, and 5 in full counterpoint, very freely transcribed and adapted for piano. Rather curious about those. But tonight we're going to hear them played on the cello by Robert Max. Enjoy. Thank you.